Carl Wahren was born in 1933 in Sweden. He studied and taught political science, international relations, and economics at universities in Sweden, the USA, and France. Carl began working on population and development in 1962 and from 1965 at SIDA, the Swedish International Development Agency. SIDA successfully assisted some of the earliest family planning programs in Ceylon, South Korea, and elsewhere. Carl served as witness at the US Senate hearings on population and development in 1966. At the UN's Population Conference in Bucharest in 1974, Carl led the drafting of the consensus statement. He has been Secretary General of IPPF, the International Planned Parenthood Federation, and head of the Aid Management Division at OECD. Throughout his career, he has been motivated by broad concerns about responsible parenthood, environmental matters, and the balance between human demands and resources. Carl, please, can you introduce yourself and explain how you became involved with family planning?
Well, I was very lucky to have a scholarship at the University of Southern California in the late 1950s. And on the 1st of November, if I recall correctly, John F. Kennedy, this great person, visited our campus. And since I was a foreign graduate student, I didn't only have the privilege of listening to him and his extraordinarily inspiring speech on the theme, let's not ask what somebody can do for you, let's ask yourself what you can do for them instead. And afterward, after 2 hours, I was selected out to have a private talk with him together with some other foreign graduate students. And he was such a charismatic person. And I wrote a long letter home to say, incredible. So I was dead set on work in his spirit internationally. That was macrocosmos. Microcosmos, my mother all her life worked very hard for impoverished women, underprivileged. She had a family with abortion history, with miseries of social, so on and so forth. So through her I got the microcosmos of the plight of women and how in most cultures they are really put in a second layer of society and need every possible support they can get. So that's the combination, macro Kennedy, micro mother.
Thank you. So which countries was Sweden involved with in family planning? What was the primary aim of these programs?
Well, in many ways you can say that the aims of the programs that started with a group of very concerned Swedish women, politicians, almost all of them, but interestingly enough coming from the whole political spectrum, from the left to the right, with a predominance perhaps of left and liberal, but also with significant contributions from the right. They had seen the tragedies in Sweden during our transition from an agricultural society in the turn of last century, then the 10s, the 20s. They had accompanied and participated in the change of laws, giving women a little bit more to say in society, in heritage, voting, a right to family planning, and so on and so forth. So when they traveled to the third world, where some of the colonies had now received independence, they were shocked to see what was happening. And since at that time, the fact was that inoculation campaigns and slight improvements in the daily level of living had brought about a dramatic decline in death rates, but a still remaining high rate of birth rates. This meant that you started having a so-called, what was then called population explosion. The very first country was Ceylon, Sri Lanka today. Then it was Pakistan, Tunisia, gradually South Korea, Malaysia, and others. But I will add here something very interesting, which today is probably completely forgotten. Between very dedicated people who stood for all the commercial activities of SIDA, of the International Planned Parenthood, and of the Population Council in New York, they created a way in which you could pressurize prices on condoms and oral pills and similar equipment immensely because of the extreme volume of purchases. And anybody who wanted could sign up and become part of that consortium. So this means that lots of countries, including Turkey and Iran and Costa Rica and other Caribbean islands, etc., they all joined the consortium for buying, in which they were completely anonymous. But it was the troika of the leadership in the commercial sector of Sweden, IPPF and Population Council, that would really pressurize all the prices for basic commodities. So thereby you can say directly and indirectly Sweden was involved with several dozens of countries.
So if you pick one of the countries here, Sri Lanka or Ceylon was the name then, how did you go ahead when you contacted?
Well, interestingly enough, which at times accuses the family planners for having been very much population control people, this was not at all how it started, just the other way around. It was a lady with the name of Silvia Fernando. She was a leading person in the Family Planning Association of Ceylon. She contacted the Swedish female ambassador in New Delhi, Alva Myrdal, and said, you Swedish women are so advanced in rights and your status in society, couldn't you help us a little bit in Sri Lanka, and starting with the family planning side. She knew, of course, of Elise Ottesen Jensen, and she was quite well informed. So she took it upon herself, the ambassador, to check with Stockholm. And as you can well imagine, the Swedes didn't rush out and say, hey, they want us to do family planning. Not at all. They thought it was a rather peculiar thing. Sweden had never, ever before worked with family planning internationally. So could they really do it? How about the religious, the sensitive sides of it? But it took them 2 years to decide, and finally they came out of the closet and said, yes, we can do this. Then, again, contrary to conventional wisdom, it all started exactly how the opponents today of family planning would like to start. It was a doctor, nurses, female trainers, clinics with Sinhalese and with Tamils, so that there would be no ethnic differences, etc., for political reasons. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it was done on a trial basis. So it was called the Sweden-Ceylon Family Planning Pilot Project.
And this was in
1958.
68.
58.
58.
Yeah. And so there was a very strong research component from the very beginning, because I told you about IPPF a little while ago. Mm-hmm. I mean, they were so anxious to know from the day one what happened, what worked, what didn't work, how did women react, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. So it was very scientifically done, given the difficult circumstances, of course, in the tea plantations and up on the hills. But Sri Lanka was a very good example, because only 10 years earlier, malaria had been almost completely eradicated because of modern medicals. They had sprayed the whole thing, and so now the population was just exploding in that little island. That's how it began.
That's interesting. And what about South Korea? Was it similar development? Or?
Well, let's just make a quick parenthesis of Pakistan. because exactly the same model was applied in Pakistan, in Karachi, in Lahore, in Chittagong, in what later on became Bangladesh, and with clinics in a few other places. Nada success. There was nobody locally who could care at all. There was lip service in case they could get some commodities or whatever, but there was no interest. And I must say that all the doctors, the teams that went there, educators, the public relations people, you know, etc., they tried, based on India, you know, to paint family planning messages on elephants and other things in order to spread the word out in the villages. It was a total failure, total failure. Now, when you go to Korea, you really go to the super success story. Everything was done the right way from the day go in Korea. After this devastating civil war, the land was completely devastated. We shouldn't talk about Gaza and other places, but certainly very big parts of Korea looked like nothing but ruins. And it was agricultural. It had no rich resources in the south. They were all, to the extent that they exist, up to the north, etc. The government said, we cannot have this population increase. But then, as I said, they did everything right. Instead of centralizing, as in Pakistan, in India in those days, and in many other places, they decentralized the whole activity. Who should be the bearers of the news and the communicators of the services, etc.? Well, it must be at the village level. I think that they had something like 30,000 villages. So, not the male leader of the village. No. He couldn't communicate with the ladies. His wife could. And the leader's wife, the village leader's wife, had status because she was married to the leader. And the Korean villages already were quite active in home economics, in basic services, water treatment, house, what do you call it when you have, chickens and eggs and poultry and all of these kind of things. So all of these services were based in the villages. Now, how did you do that? They had very poor medical infrastructure. Well, they brought the services to the people, not the people to the services. And there Sweden had the good fortune, I had the good fortune to come in from the very beginning in this program. So we provided them not only with commodities, etc., but with Land Rovers that could come out even to the most distant areas. And you had mobile teams coming out with the services, all handled by the local village leadership. Therefore, there was no credibility problem, no suspension. This is something they do from the capital, from Seoul. This is for them, it's good for them. And it went together with women's classes in education, in household, hygiene, all the rest of it. It was an absolute role model.
Well, you sometimes hear accusations from people say that these programs were driven by international agendas, not from within the countries. But what you tell us here is something very different.
First of all, there was no international agenda. I wish there had been. But there were international ideas. And in the case of Seoul, they had this tremendous guy called Paul Hartman. Paul Hartman worked for the Population Council. His nearest boss worked in Taichung in Taiwan. And there was Sam Keeney, who was one of the most charismatic people I've ever met. He was a scholar in antique history, and he was a scholar, in the best universities about old Greece, old Rome, etc. And as boss for the refugee movements during the Second World War, he had completely turned around and applied his intelligence, vision, and perspectives now on the well-being of people. But these two guys, there was no agenda whatsoever. They were there. They were supporting local initiatives, handing in good, practical advice, and offering seed money for little pilot activities. And I was invited there first time, I think, in 64, 63, 64 for a conference. And then, of course, SIDA was known as a rich cow, in those days. We may not have lots of brain, but we had lots of money. So the young man who was representing Swedish population policy, I certainly had not very much experience. They took me to the side and said, look, we think this is a fantastic story. You could invest a lot of money here, and we are here to help. Also, they introduced me to all the top leadership in medicine and in social anthropology, etc., in Korea proper. Excellent people. So they were always in command, but they needed this intelligence, inputs, and honest broker to the rich cow, SIDA, who then come in early, and could provide. And later on, actually, SIDA even was partner together with USAID and Korea in creating the Korean Institute for Family Planning, which was a combined training, research, analysis, laboratory, etc., thing, not only for Korea, but for Southeast Asia.
Our next question here, in the implementation of these programs, how did population and development concerns interact with issues of women's health and rights?
Since the whole movement was started by women, surprise, surprise, that issue came up from the very first beginning.
Oh, yeah.
And we can see the Ceylonese program, the oldest in the world, created by women. We could see how in Korea, village heads, women, conducted the whole thing and gave their prestige and everything, its credibility. And so I would say that from the very outset, there was a great deal of understanding about the role of women and the importance of women. And so whenever you could make, whenever you could sort of hit two flies with one stone, obviously you would do it. And there was very close collaboration with the first women's conferences and the International Family Planning Movement. And in those days, before all this flagging started, with feminism and with this and that and the other, there was no antagonism. Mm-hmm. In fact, the most radical women leaders I knew, well, they were both on both frontiers, and they often tried to join the frontiers, so that because they serve the same purpose, what is best for women. Every child born should be a child to be taken care of, with the possibility to study, to work, to eat, and finally to go out and support himself or herself. No, it was an absolute amalgamation of views from the beginning. Now, this is not to say that in all countries, particularly in countries with extreme patriarchal systems, or Catholic religious systems, or fundamentalist Muslim, there, of course, the argument could be quite difficult sometimes. And that is an interesting point, because that's why the concept family planning is so important. Family planning was rather neutral to women. Now I'm contradicting myself, it seems, but I'm not. And when you talk to ministers of finance or ministers of planning, they are the toughest ministers in any developing country, or in most countries. And when you came up and talked to them and showed them demographic projections, where their country would be in 15 years, in 20 years, arable land, drinking water, climate change, out fishing, etc., etc., etc. They understood that. That had nothing to do with women's health, nothing to do with the status of women. It was planning problem. And that's why you could convince them to talk and to put money for family planning programs and start something, because they saw the socioeconomic consequences. That's why when the whole terminology changed, you know, from family planning or population policy or population planning, whatever, into reproductive health and the women's, all of that. You lost their ear. Mm-hmm. They weren't interesting. And ministers of health are usually the lowest ranking ministers in almost any government anywhere in the world. Mm-hmm. Very low ranking.
But the ones you met in some countries, they were apparently more wise, I understand, because they welcomed this and also some help with the programs in those ministries. Or was that certain individuals only?
Usually I would say they were at a fairly high level.
Okay.
And I think that an excellent example to bring here is, of course, the Kenyan president, Mwai Kibaki. I was attending the first or the second, I think the first women's conference was in Copenhagen, wasn't it? And or in Mexico, wherever. Anyway, this was the third or so in Nairobi, 1980, and no, 1984. 1984. He turned the whole issue of population policy upside down. He said, "It was you guys," pointing at me, "who destroyed the whole climate for broad appreciation of population control, or fertility control rather, not population, fertility control." In the traditional society in Kenya, or in Africa, he says, there was always a tradition not to have more children than would be good for the mother's health, for the family, for the little spots that they, you know, you cannot cultivate food if you don't have enough arable land, and therefore you cannot have too many mouths. And after the population increase started, before one used to say, another birth, another pair of hands to work, to toil. But now with so many people and no new land, a new birth is no longer a pair of hands, it's a mouth.
Yeah, to be sure.
It's a hungry mouth.
Fertility rate is 4.5 in sub-Saharan Africa still, I mean.
Then he added, even the Kenyan birds were wise enough never to lay an egg until they had put down good nests. So even the birds see that you must have a home, a house, before you start reproducing. That's why we thought also. Then comes the colonialism, with Victorianism, with Christian and other religious, you know, and start talking about sin and making this whole thing very, 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 very obscure. He says, it's you, the Western powers, who destroyed the natural inclination and tradition here to really plan the families like even our birds do. I found that interesting.
Yeah, even today, it's a sad story so far. But let's go back in time here. What do you recall about the events leading up to the formation of the UNFPA, the United Nations Population Fund? Who were the leading voices advocating for it? And was there widespread support or polarized debate around this organization?
Let's first remember that the UN system is a very complex one. Most people know nothing about it. Nothing. First you have the UN General Assembly. All countries are represented. They voted the other day, you know, in the Israeli-Hamas conflict, etc. Under them comes the Economic and Social Council. The Economic and Social Council has direct links with specialized agencies, with regional economic and social commissions, and with a variety of things. Under the ECOSOC comes a lot of commissions and other things, like the Population Commission, which is going to play a very important role in this context. Then you have all the specialized agencies, UNICEF, WHO, ILO, UNESCO, etc., each fighting for turf, fighting for resources, difficult to coordinate. Then you have the regional economic centers, like ECAFE in Bangkok, like in Santiago de Chile, and they run a regional business, with representatives from all these others. I mean, that's the political background. The whole thing started with people, and this was an American initiative. We need a special funding window, they called it, for population. So, in all discretion, without much ado, they created a trust fund. But the trust fund didn't have at all the same status, the same prestige. They couldn't, they came hat in hand when they came to the agencies and they came to the other sort of big shots. So they considered, no, we need to do something better with a higher prestige within the society. But my recollection is it was done rather discreetly. They managed to get the resolutions in ECOSOC, the support of the Population Commission, and you had key donors. That's important. Mm-hmm. No money, no new institutions. And you had the key donors, America, the like-minded, that means Holland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Canada. And gradually the trust fund sort of evolved into this UN Fund for Population Activities.
Now, one of the first activities of the UNFPA was to organize this first international population conference involving political leaders, and that was in Bucharest 1974. Can you tell us about that meeting?
Well, I have to add, though, that before that happened, Rafael Salas, who was, you can say, the founding father of the UNFPA. I was then in charge of the population research program at the OECD, and I was very delighted when I got a cable from the Philippines asking if he could come and have lunch with me. So we spent half a day together in Paris. It must have been in '69, I think, on his first trip to New York, when he should see the leadership there and discuss. And he was a very level-headed fellow. He rapidly understood that they would be no stronger than if they had local representatives. So they appointed local representatives, and the whole administration of the UNFPA was taken care of by United Nations Development Program that had a very strong position within the UN. Also, he organized the first couple of years major visiting teams to some of the big countries like India and Pakistan, etc., to just to see what does it look like. Then came the decision to have this World Population Conference. Mind you, they had one 10 years earlier in Rome, but then it was only for scientists, demographers, researchers, etc. This time it was all intended to be a political conference with a political agenda, a plan of action. I have this documentation here. And he did something very wise. He appointed a very experienced foreign minister from Mexico with the name of Carrillo Flores. And this was an absolutely charming old man. And he traveled around as a public relations guy for this, encouraging governments all over. And with his status as foreign minister, he was well received. I remember receiving him in Stockholm, and so on and so forth. So they built up an understanding. Then also in the mandate from the POP Commission, it was very clearly stated that this conference would be no better, no worse than the investment by the governments themselves. And so already in 72 and early 73, for instance in Sweden, which of course was one of the great protagonists, we created a national preparatory committee for Bucharest. Then there were questionnaires. Each country had to fill in a questionnaire about very, very basics in their population structure. So for the first time, the Population Commission received, not from everybody, but from a fair amount of people, they received how would I call it, kartläggning in Swedish. It was really a mapping out. This is what it looks like. Country here, country there, etc. This is the distribution, age distribution, sex distribution, urban, countryside, age groups, death rates, birth rates, etc. And then there were preparatory regional meetings, equally important. So before everybody went to Bucharest, there had been regional meetings, national commission meetings. Carrillo Flores traveled around, participated, encouraged, go ahead, work hard. And so Bucharest was a very, very well prepared meeting, which I can't tell of any other meeting. Do you know from ecology or from environment with so many preparatory meetings?
No, it seems to be impressive.
Yes.
And actually you ended up chairing the negotiations to the draft, the outcome document from the conference. Tell us about that process and how consensus was reached.
After 2 days in Bucharest, there was an official drafting committee headed by a Marxist Algerian who couldn't care less about population or women. He was a very macho type of guy. Very macho type of guy. Also, he was full of ideological things, new independence, new this, new that, etc., etc. It was chaos. And when we came to the end of the second day of negotiations in that committee, they hadn't even agreed the preambular, which was the introductory remarks before they went into the 109 paragraphs, 106. So I heard these reputations, I had been there myself. I talked to my friends and I spread the word. All of those who are concerned that this doesn't become a total fiasco, let's meet there and there. And I contacted the Romanian authorities, and they were also getting very afraid things were going to go bad. It would have reflected very badly on Ceausescu. He would not have been very happy. So they fixed a very nice meeting room, and after proceedings that day at 6 o'clock, when everybody else had gone to the cocktail parties and all the rest of it, there turned up to be, 30 or 40 people from all over the world, mostly from the third world, but also some of my colleagues from the rich. And I stood up on a table and I said, look, we have worked for years for this conference and now it is threatened by total failure. We need to have a group that negotiates honestly and professionally the paragraphs for the action plan before they go into this hopeless bunch of jerks that are not serious but just sit there and talk. Hey, hallelujah. And on that spot I was elected chairman of the new group, and we sent out the people to the organizers, and we said we need now good meeting space for the next 7 or 8 days and nights where we can meet, but also small rooms where I could, as chairman, send out people to negotiate in smaller groups and come in with a consensus. And it worked. The British ambassador offered me to send as much boost as we wanted You know, what did we prefer? Should it be gin and tonic? Should it be whiskey? Should it be malt? Should it be this and that? And I gratefully accepted that in order to keep people there, because we worked until midnight, but everybody was told no booze before 11 p.m. That's when we open up the corks and we can start having a little bit fun by discussing the last hour. And with those kind of things, we finally managed to pass on to the official group, paragraph by paragraph, paragraph by paragraph, already agreed.
But if you look at the final document, I understand that population growth, fertility rates, so not only family planning were in focus, but a full understanding of development issues.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Migration, urbanization, women's rights, adoption. We managed from Sweden to get adoption included in the world plan as equal rights, you know, with biological births.
Sure, I can understand that. Well, then it took 10 years to the next conference. So from 1974.
Before you go on, Frank,
okay,
let me just say that 5 months after the Bucharest conference, Mexico changed their constitution to put family planning into their constitution. Mexico, which had been quite pro-natalist up till then. And that is just one example of how this intense collaboration until midnight for 6-7 days that week forced them into sitting rooms where they would meet for the first time and sit with somebody from the Samoa Islands who would describe that they have a few coconut trees and the water is increasing, you know, to those who say they have infinite land masses. Population is not a problem. It had a very strong psychological impact.
Yes.
And it was followed up with regional conferences just as in preparations.
Okay.
So there was a routing in all the regions of the plan of action, and it was discussed how could this be adjusted and fitted in to the various economic regions of the UN system. And I participated in all of these meetings also. So it was very much an in-depth thing, which really was part of its success.
So this was the basic, most important conference. And Mexico City in 1984, well, what was learned during those 10 years? Was it implementation of this plan from...
It was stock taking. It was stock taking, no extremely ambitious preparations, no national reports. But the Secretariat, of course, had sort of done a summary, analyzed a little bit what was happening, pointed out where things were good, where things were not so good. And then we drafted in Mexico City. And again, because of my record, I was one of the drafting members of the Mexico City Declaration.
So
and
Mexico City confirmed largely.
Basically confirmed and added and subtracted. And just to show you the difference between the world today and then, the whole Mexico City Declaration was in extenso published in New York Times.
Oh, interesting.
It just shows you, I mean, importance of this issue and all of these issues.
Yeah.
This comes out a little stronger also on ecology and environment, and it's a very good statement. We were 5-6 people who worked it out without much discussion. There was a great deal of agreement. So, but it's interesting that it was published.
I understand that the general opinion changed over these years. You once told me about an event in Germany. Can you recall that? Where you met the country leader and got some of his ideas about family planning in Germany.
Are you thinking about Helmut Schmidt?
Yeah, I remember you mentioned that earlier.
Well, that of course is far more important than family planning. I believe it must have been 1980 when the first or the second G5 meeting took place in Cancun in Mexico. And I was working then in London, and Salas was still around in New York. And Salas and I were invited to come to brief Chancellor Helmut Schmidt in Bonn. That was before Berlin had come back into the... And so it was a very, very fascinating meeting. When we had briefed him on all possible aspects of the population sustainable development equation, then he asked, "Do you have any questions to ask me?" And already then, of course, people were discussing the shrinking birth rates in Eastern Europe. And in Bulgaria, in many of these places, you got a fair amount of money if you had another child. And a famous story was this highly pregnant woman who climbs on a bus, and somebody's a little bit rough, and she shouts at him, say, "Careful, don't destroy my TV." You know, pointing at her belly. "Don't destroy my TV." So things were interesting. So I asked the Chancellor, how do you look at the possibility that Germany may actually have a shrinking population? He smiled. He was an extraordinary nice man. He looked at his minister, who was sitting beside, his chef de cabinet, who was sitting there, and he said, "I'm not quite sure whether my compatriots here would agree with me, what you're going to hear me say now, Mr. Wahren. But I think it would be a blessing if Germany could lose a number of millions of its population. 5, perhaps even more. Mm-hmm. We would have a greater living area to live. We would have much, much better quality of life. We will be able to save greeneries, reintroduce various forms of life that have now been pushed out."
Turning to another issue, what was the attitude to coerced or forced prevention of childbearing, and what was your position there? I guess you may recall China and things like this.
All depends where you look. I mean, the debate really started with the vasectomy problems in India.
Yeah.
And that was fairly tough, because it really meant that you bribed extraordinarily poor people in order to cut their vas. It was men in 9 cases out of 10. The government then decided we should go out, because in SIDA there was a revolution. They didn't want to have anything to do with India, anything. And so the government wisely said, let's go out and see what's actually happening. We spent a couple of weeks in India immediately after some of those scandals had exploded. To my great surprise, I see in my notes, we even saw the Prime Minister, Morarji Desai. Even Morarji Desai, his social minister, Gonzalez, and other people we talked to admitted that they had been very, very anxious to send in good results, and they had really, but they could count the cases, and it was certainly in far, far, far from all over India. On the other hand, I witnessed some of these sterilization camps myself, and my impression was horrible, horrible. Then we had another completely lateral thought on this thing when we talked to a lady doctor who lived in the countryside where this had happened. She said, yes, Western gentlemen, I understand your concern. Absolutely, it's not a nice thing. But let me offer one other perspective. These guys who have been vasectomized, they will probably continue to more or less rape their wives on Saturdays when they have used whatever little they earn for drinking and so on and so forth. But now the difference is that their wives will not become pregnant every time. So what turns out to be something hideous, awful, against these men, you know, for a small radio or 30 rupees or something to do this, for their wives, it offers quite another perspective. You must also bring this into the total perspective.
But then you actually visited China when they unfortunately started their program, their so-called one-child program.
Well, we negotiated China because they had expressed strong wills to become members of the IPPF. And that put us at some surprise. The only government that was a member of the IPPF was Botswana, which is the smallest country in Africa. And then the biggest country in the world comes and says, can we become members? Well, you know, it was absurd. But we had a series of missions, and we received a series of visitors from China towards the late 70s, early 80s. And around 81, we signed all the agreement papers in Beijing, etc., etc. Now, I must say I have very mixed feelings, because it's so easy to make comparisons between India and China. But, and there is so much differing information about China. So many different things. Again, the country is enormous, and some leadership, country leadership, were much more humanistic and humanitarian and soft than others that are much more brutal. And so, but obviously when they were in London and when I was out there on a number of occasions, we tried to say that if you want to become members of the IPPF, you must abide by our rules and principles, and that precludes any sort of violence and so on and so forth.
Like coerced abortions and things like that.
That's right.
Which actually happened.
And they understood, but political decisions in China, you don't go as a civil servant and ask and question.
Now, what about the role of the Vatican? That's been much discussed in the population debate. So that started in 1960s and continued all the way through the conferences, if I'm right?
The story of the Vatican is a real tragedy. I happened to be with my then boss in Rome in 1964, I believe. And at that time, you had a papal commission working on the possibilities of doing something for family planning. The Pope had appointed the leading moral theologian with the name of Bernard Wahren. Bernard Wahren. We had a 1-hour session with him in his office, and I will never forget that. The Vatican at that time was quite ready to accept family planning with the use of contraceptive pills. Why is that? They had done extensive research with all their best medical faculties and Catholic world and others. And when a woman breastfeeds her child, there is something called prolactin, which is being a hormone which comes out. And the prolactin prevents the egg to really fasten in the uterus. So God had already given woman who has just given birth to a child a certain protection as long as she is breastfeeding. And that, of course, has been a well-known period, a well-known method for family planning in many cultures in many, many years. I remember my own relatives up in Northland. They breastfed the kids up to 2 years, and it was not just for health reasons, but it was also because that was the only way they hoped to be able to prevent another pregnancy. had done such good research on this. It was all ready, and it would have been a magnificent gift to humanity. Instead, two old Italian super reactionary cardinals had heard of this and tried everything to stop it. And when it finally came to the counting in the group of the cardinals, then they voted against. And unfortunately, in the Catholic Church, you don't have a matter of majority vote or unanimity versus consensus. You have two votes. If you have two votes, it doesn't matter. In the one case, 64, 2 against. Then you have to appoint another commission to settle this issue. That other commission, before it saw the day, was filled with reactionary types who were absolutely against. And as a result, in 1968 came Humane Vitae, which forbid any sort of contraception, any sort of thing, etc., etc., etc. Now, what is almost forgotten in all international context is the impact of this when John Paul II became Pope. He then used this as an absolute no-no for using condoms in the explosion of SIDA, of AIDS.
Yeah, that came later on. Mm-hmm.
So as a result of this later on, hundreds of thousands of African women were, infested by AIDS viruses, etc., by their husbands. All those lorry drivers who drive. There are brothels all over the place, and so on and so forth. So this was a catastrophe, and it was so close, for good reasons, to find a solution.
Do you feel that the Vatican were the major opposition in Cairo? That was the conference in 1994, and there were other kinds of opposition against family planning also. What do you remember from this conference?
I was there, of course, but in no official function. My honest answer is I'm still bewildered. I'm still confused. I can see little bits and pieces of mosaic, such as feminism, which over the years had taken on, in my mind, most peculiar aspects. Inheriting some of the old Marxist thing, that family planning is instead of providing justice, instead of giving them other help, education, etc., then we just keep them in slavery, and birth control and help to regulate fertility became touted with so many bad things, totally unnecessarily. Then you had a resurgence, of course, of some of the Marxists who joined this, and you had the mullahs, and you had all those big bearded guys, and you had, unfortunately, no renovation in the Vatican. So you can add a number of these bits and pieces together. And as Winston Churchill said, wars make for strange bedfellows. And this had been building up for a long time, and I couldn't hear when I heard all the rumors that were said about family planning. No, they don't talk about family, for sexual and reproductive health. I mean, what the hell.
Do you think the fate of what happened in China influenced the conference too?
Not really.
Okay,
Not
that
really.
was a single example.
Not really.
There were so many countries that had practiced voluntary family planning.
Oh yes.
So the conference delegates should be aware of that.
Absolutely.
So
I think it became an unofficial excuse quite often in order to find the rationale for that stating. They would say, well, look at China.
Yeah, that's the first answer you get when you discuss
And then
this.
nobody dares to talk against it.
Mm.
So it was a terrible thing.
Mm. But there were other kinds of political opposition against family planning also, like in Western countries.
I think there was another one sidetrack that has been very important in many places, not least in the United States, which we have seen, I mean, only this year, and that is the abortion issue.
Oh yeah.
The abortion issue, the rights to life movement and all of that, that seems to be able to enlist any kind of emotional exercises. I mean, people get so totally upset about it. And at the time that threatened a very substantial part of the funding for UNFPA in Mexico City, because it was in Mexico City that the American State Department had created what they called a gag rule, and that was an absolute on abortion. I remember when I was boss in IPPF, when this was actual, we had a team led by an army general from the United States. And that team spent 3 weeks, 3 people, going through every single receipt, every single piece of paper to see that none of the American contributions to the IPPF even went into a meeting where the issue was discussed.
And you can see the change after 1994 because you worked in the OECD then during the 90s. Was it directly after the conference or was there a slow change? And many programs ended, many family planning programs ended for some reason. So
I found the OECD amazingly neutral and amazingly open. I could write freely in the OECD Observer, which I did on numerous occasions. And that's a highly respected review that goes out in French and English to all the OECD countries. And I managed to get one special issue out called Population, Environment, Resources, an Inseparable Troika. And that was so well received that finally UNFPA asked me if they could reproduce it in their Populi magazine, which of course I happily agreed with, or OECD rather, you know, copyright, etc. I had another extensive article on AIDS and the relationships, and I could produce any amount of documents for the DAC, the Development Assistance Committee, on population. We even had special meetings on population in which we analyzed. Boomgards was one of them, who then provided one of the background documents as to the effects of family planning, in which already then we could see that hundreds and hundreds of millions of unwanted kids had been helped not to be born to this world because of family planning. I find it extremely interesting.
yeah, let's return to population growth because the human population is so large. We still have about 80 million people extra each year. There was some sad news recently from the UNFPA. They recently stated that population control was conducted without heed to people's reproductive aspirations, their health, or the health of their children. What do you think about this statement and how would you like to respond to them?
It's not even worth commenting. It's absolute rubbish. Absolute rubbish. And I worked with Rafael Salas, I worked with Nafis Sadiq, I worked with Kerstin Trone, I worked with all these people, I mean, who headed UNFPA. I was even on the technical board. It's absolute rubbish. This is fake news. This is the modern world we live in. Fake news being produced like this. And
it's pretty remarkable because the the UN food program, they report that undernourishment increases. I mean, and so it seems that the population factor, the number of people, they talk about health and reproduction, but they don't talk about numbers. So that's my feeling. And
increasingly, though, I must say, I listen to BBC every day, and I try to follow up as much as I can. It's ever more increasing that the interviewer or the commentator talk about the world population, the masses of people living on the earth, all their needs. And so even if a figure isn't mentioned, but the fact is that the demand side is still increasing. I think it's more of that today than only 2 or 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, we can be pretty sure that the population question will come back. So thank you for sharing those memories, these important things you have mentioned here. So finally, do you have some memory you would like to end this interview with?
Absolutely. Ever since 40 years or something, I carry this little coin next to my heart because it shows what intelligent, visionary people can mean to the world. The coin was produced 1981, and it says, "Planned families, food for all." And this is the most common spread coin in Congo. If ever you go down to buy a piece of bread or you buy a piece of anything, everybody has this. And it's written on, and on the other side you have a happy wheat field, you know, etc., etc. So, I mean, this kind of public information I find absolutely extraordinary and so easy if you have the will and the vision. And of course the people in this Pacific, you know, they know what's coming. They've seen it, they know what's coming. But I mean, to have the guts then to go out and do something about it is quite something. And it also is very close to my heart because the Queen of Tonga was the first one ever to use the word family planning in the UN General Assembly. Why could she do it? The Swedish delegate had tried once, and he was told that unless he shut up, he would be thrown out by the gods. But you could never treat the head of state that way.
And a woman.
A head of state? No, it was a head of state.
Okay.
A head of state could never be stopped for saying something, you know, discretionary, whatever. So she went on to say, you know, we need this. Afterwards they produced this. I think it's just great.
That's a great memory.
Yeah.
Thank you, Carl.